Paul Amadeus Dienach, on his deathbed, handed over his diaries to one of his students. Diaries holding the real-life account.
Imagine falling into a coma and waking up with memories not from your past, but from the year 3906. That's exactly what Paul Amadeus Dienach claimed happened to him in the 1920s.
In 1924, Paul Amadeus Dienach had been teaching the German language in Greece. Dying of tuberculosis, he wanted to return home to Switzerland. Before he left, he gave hundreds of pages of handwritten notes to his favorite language student.
He said he lived inside someone else's body in the future, saw what the world had become, and came back with a message. He never planned to share it. But now, people are reading his journals and wondering if he was telling the truth. Time travel or consciousness shift? Let's talk about the big question. Did Paul Amadeus Dienach actually time travel, or was something else going on? Dienach never claimed he built a machine, stepped into a wormhole, or used any kind of futuristic tech to reach the year 3906. In fact, his story doesn't involve anything like what you'd see in a sci-fi movie. Instead, what he described was something much stranger, and in some ways, even harder to explain. He said that while his body lay in a coma in the 20s, his consciousness somehow slipped into the future. More specifically, it entered the body of a man named Andreas Northam, who was living in the year 3906. Dienach didn't control Northam's body, but he was fully aware of everything happening. Like a silent passenger inside someone else's mind, he could see, feel, and understand the world around him. He watched Northam's life unfold and absorbed everything he could about that time. It wasn't like a dream, he said. It was real. He remembered it all. The language, the cities, the people, the way society functioned, even the philosophy and mindset of the future humans. It was overwhelming, but clear. And when he woke up back in his own body, the memories stayed with him. So what exactly happened? Was it time travel or something else entirely? One theory is that it was a form of consciousness projection, something similar to what mystics and spiritual traditions call astral travel or remote viewing. These are experiences where a person's awareness detaches from their physical body and travels elsewhere, sometimes to distant places, sometimes to different time periods. It's not science fiction, but it's definitely outside the bounds of mainstream science. Another theory is that Dienach somehow tuned in to a kind of universal memory or collective future, an idea found in some branches of metaphysics and even quantum theory. In this view, time isn't strictly linear, and all moments, past, present, and future, exist simultaneously. Under certain conditions, someone might catch a glimpse of what's to come, not by physically going there, but by accessing it through consciousness. Still, not everyone goes that deep. Some believe Dienach experienced a vivid, extended lucid dream or a form of coma-induced hallucination. The mind, after all, is capable of astonishing detail and complexity. We've all had dreams that feel real, and if you spent a year in an altered state, maybe your brain could build a world that feels just as real as this one. But here's where things get even weirder. Dienach didn't just describe random future gadgets or flying cars. He described cultural shifts, psychological changes, and even new ways of thinking. The people of 3906 weren't just more advanced, they were fundamentally different from us. He said humanity had evolved beyond money, war, and even traditional governments. People communicated partly through telepathy, and society was guided by ethics and collective wisdom, not power or wealth. It wasn't just about the future, it was about who we might become. And that's why some people don't see his story as time travel at all. They see it as something deeper, a vision of potential. Maybe Dienach tapped into a kind of future memory that exists beyond our usual understanding. Or maybe he connected to a version of reality shaped by the collective hopes or fears of humanity. Of course, it could also be fiction. A really detailed, well-constructed fiction written by a man who never claimed to be a prophet or a storyteller, which only makes it harder to ignore. Whatever happened during Dienach's coma, he came back changed. And what he remembered was so specific, so vivid, and so human that it still sparks debate nearly 100 years later. Was he a traveler, a dreamer, a man who glimpsed a hidden truth? The answers might lie in what he saw and wrote about the world of 3906, the future, according to Dienach. All right, so let's get into it. What exactly did Dienach say the world looked like in the year 3906? His journal, often referred to as the Chronicles of the Future, paints a surprisingly detailed picture, not just of technology or politics, but of how people lived, how they thought, and how humanity had changed. What's most striking isn't the gadgets or cities, it's the mindset of the people. According to Dienach, the future wasn't just more advanced, it was almost unrecognizable in terms of values, priorities, and consciousness. In 3906, according to Dienach, humanity no longer lived in nations or states as we know them. There were no traditional governments. Instead, Earth was united under a world parliament, not a dictatorship, but a kind of council made up of wise individuals chosen based on merit, ethics, and knowledge. There were no political parties, no elections in the way we understand them, just a system based on collective intelligence and mutual respect. The idea of competition between countries had disappeared. War, as a concept, no longer existed. Resources were shared globally, and decisions were made with the long-term good of humanity and the planet in mind. Perhaps the most shocking detail to modern readers, money was gone. In its place was a resource-based system. People didn't work for paychecks. They contributed based on their skills and passions, and society provided what they needed in return. It wasn't about personal accumulation, it was about mutual support and shared abundance. Dienach wrote that the idea of financial inequality, greed, or poverty simply didn't exist anymore, not because of forced equality, but because the entire mindset had shifted. People no longer measured success through material gain, they measured it by growth, wisdom, and contribution. You might expect flying cars, robot cities, or crazy space colonies, but Dienach's future didn't focus on flashy tech. In fact, he said the most powerful technologies were subtle, seamlessly integrated into everyday life. Artificial intelligence existed, but not as something separate or dominant. It was more like an extension of human thought, intelligent systems working quietly in the background, maintaining balance and handling logistics so that people could focus on living meaningful lives. Disease had been virtually eliminated. Agriculture was fully automated. Energy came from clean, limitless sources, probably something akin to fusion or advanced solar. Everything was clean, sustainable, and efficient. The world wasn't just advanced, it was balanced. Education in 3906 wasn't about passing tests or memorizing facts. It was about personal development, ethics, self-awareness, and exploration of consciousness. From an early age, people were taught how to understand themselves, relate to others, and grow as individuals. There was no religion in the traditional sense, but there was deep spiritual awareness. People believed in something beyond themselves, not dogma, but a shared understanding that human consciousness was part of something bigger. Art, philosophy, and inner development were central to life. People weren't driven by fear or status. They were driven by curiosity, connection, and collective evolution. One of the most mysterious parts of Dienach's account was the idea that humans had evolved, not biologically, but consciously. He said a new stage of humanity had emerged, Homo occidens novus, or the new Western man. These future humans had developed mental and emotional capacities far beyond our own. They were not superhumans in a sci-fi sense, but rather deeply aware beings, capable of telepathic communication, empathy at scale, and profound emotional intelligence. This wasn't something that happened overnight. It was the result of centuries of evolution, struggle, and conscious choice. And according to Dienach, it was humanity's natural path, not a fantasy, but an eventual outcome. Dienach's version of the future is hard to classify. It's not a dystopia. It's not a techno-utopia either. It's more like a spiritual civilization, one where people have finally stopped fighting for survival and started focusing on who they really are and what they're really here for. He didn't describe a perfect world, but he described a healed one, a world that had gone through enormous suffering, conflict, and collapse, and come out wiser on the other side. Of course, all of this raises the obvious question: how did we get there from here? And that's where Dienach's writings take a darker turn. A dark history that led to utopia. For all the peace, wisdom, and balance Paul Amadeus described in the year 3906, he made one thing very clear: humanity didn't arrive there easily. According to his journal, the future was only possible because of a long, difficult period of collapse and transformation, a process that stretched over many centuries. Dienach included a rough timeline in his writings, outlining major events and turning points that he said shaped the path toward a better world. What he laid out wasn't a sci-fi fantasy or a utopian shortcut. It was a hard road, filled with disasters, societal breakdowns, and deep change. And in many ways, it reads more like a warning than a prophecy. He described the first major phase of this transformation taking place in the 21st and 22nd centuries, basically the era we are living in now. This time period was marked by growing instability on every level: politically, environmentally, economically, and socially. Dienach talked about worsening climate disasters, widespread economic inequality, and the collapse of trust in traditional institutions. Wars didn't end, they just changed form, becoming more about ideology, control, and survival. Technology continued to evolve rapidly, but instead of liberating people, it often made them feel more disconnected, watched, and powerless. He referred to this long stretch of time as the age fragmentation, where humanity struggled with itself and drifted further from harmony. Then came what he called the Great Transition, a period spanning roughly from the 23rd century to the 29th century. According to Dienach, this was the most painful and pivotal phase in human history. Population declined sharply, not just from war or pandemics, but because people voluntarily stepped away from a broken system. The global economy collapsed, and with it, the old ideas of wealth, ownership, and profit. In the chaos, small communities and groups began experimenting with new ways of living, sharing resources, focusing on survival, and slowly rebuilding not just their world, but their sense of purpose. This wasn't a smooth or coordinated shift. Entire regions fell into conflict, while others quietly began healing. But the turning point was that people no longer believed the old systems could save them, so they started creating something new. As this new mindset spread over generations, the idea of a global human identity began to take hold. By the late 2800 and early 2900, the pieces of a more unified civilization started to come together. Dienach described this era as the rise of the unified planetary era. Humanity had learned, painfully, that it could no longer survive through division, exploitation, or endless competition. A global council replaced traditional governments, not through force, but through the natural progression toward cooperation. There was no one ideology or system of control, just a shared understanding that wisdom, ethics, and mutual respect had to guide the planet forward. By the time Dienach arrived in 3906, the world had stabilized. It wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful, balanced, and deeply focused on consciousness, growth, and sustainability. The crises of the past weren't erased or ignored. They were remembered as necessary lessons. Technology still existed, but it had become almost invisible, operating quietly in the background rather than dominating people's lives. Money was gone, and in its place was a resource-based system that emphasized contribution over competition. Education was centered on emotional intelligence, philosophy, and spiritual growth. Humanity had evolved not just in how it lived, but in how it thought. Was this a warning or a prophecy? That depends on how you interpret it. Dienach didn't claim to be a prophet. He didn't say these events were guaranteed. Instead, he presented them as possibilities, the natural consequences of continuing on a certain path. Some people see his story as a cautionary tale. If we don't change voluntarily, the world will force us to. Others view it as a strange kind of hope. If we can survive the collapse, something better might eventually emerge. Either way, his message is clear. The future isn't just about technology or progress. It's about whether we're willing to transform ourselves from the inside out. And of course, not everyone believed a word of it. The man behind the mystery. Dienach wasn't famous. He wasn't a scientist, inventor, or even someone who would have stood out in a crowd. He was a quiet man, a teacher and linguist, living in Europe during the early 20th century. He taught French and German, wrote a little in his spare time, and lived through the aftermath of World War I like everyone else around him. Nothing about his life screamed extraordinary until he fell into a coma. In 1921, Dienach became seriously ill, likely from a type of sleeping sickness that was spreading through parts of Europe after the war. He slipped into a coma for about a year. Doctors didn't expect him to recover, and for a while, it seemed like he wouldn't. But eventually, to everyone's surprise, he woke up. And that's when things got strange. According to Dienach, something had happened while he was unconscious. He didn't just sleep. He claimed that his consciousness had traveled through time. Specifically, he said he had somehow ended up inside the body of a man living in the year 3906. He wasn't dreaming. He didn't think it was a hallucination. Dienach believed that for that entire year he had been fully present in a future world, observing life from inside another person's mind. When he came back to his own body and time, he didn't tell anyone, not right away. He didn't want to be locked up, ridiculed, or dismissed as crazy. So he quietly began to write everything down in a journal. Not just the visions themselves, but what the world of 3906 was like, how people lived, what had changed, and what had led humanity there, both the good and the bad. It wasn't until years later, when Dienach was working as a teacher in Greece, that anyone else would read these writings. Before his death in 1924, he gave his journal, written entirely in German, to one of his favorite students, a young man named George Papachatsis. He didn't say much about it, just that it was important, and he trusted George to read it someday. Papachatsis didn't dive in right away. It took him years to fully translate and understand what Dienach had written. And once he did, he was stunned. Inside the journal was a detailed account of a future civilization, along with a timeline of human history stretching from Dienach's own time all the way to the 40th century. It talked about coming disasters, revolutions, breakthroughs, and a completely new kind of human consciousness. It was wild, fascinating, and also kind of terrifying. Papachatsis believed the journal was worth sharing, but it wasn't easy. Greece at the time was not a place where radical or out-there ideas were welcomed with open arms. He faced resistance from the church, pressure from the government, and plenty of people calling the whole thing a hoax. Still, he persisted, publishing parts of the journal decades later in limited releases, always careful to avoid too much controversy. Eventually, The full text was released as The Chronicles of the Future, and the story of Dienach began to spread. What makes it so compelling isn't just the futuristic world he describes, it's the fact that Dienach never intended for any of it to go public. He didn't try to make money off it. He didn't write it as a novel. He wasn't chasing fame. In fact, he seemed almost afraid of what people might think. Which raises the question, what if he really did experience something? Whether you believe he traveled through time, had a profound dream, or accessed something beyond human understanding, one thing is clear. The story he left behind is unlike anything else. To really grasp why Dienach's story sounds the way it does, what was happening in the world around him when he lived? The historical and cultural context of Dienach's experience. To better understand Paul Amadeus Dienach's astonishing story, it's essential to look at the world he lived in, early 20th century Europe, and the cultural, political, and spiritual currents that might have influenced his experience or the way he described it. After all, no vision arises in a vacuum. Our beliefs, fears, hopes, and imaginations are deeply shaped by the era we inhabit. Dienach's lifetime overlapped with some of the most turbulent times in modern history. Born in 1881 in Austria-Hungary, he witnessed the collapse of old empires, two devastating world wars, and the social upheavals that reshaped the continent. The early 20th century was marked by rapid technological progress, but also profound uncertainty and anxiety about the future. World War I tore Europe apart, shattering the illusion of steady progress and exposing humanity's capacity for destruction on an unprecedented scale. The war left millions dead, economies in ruins, and societies deeply fractured. Dienach himself fell into a coma after falling ill in the 20s, a period when Europe was struggling to rebuild and redefine itself. In the aftermath of the war, many intellectuals and artists were grappling with disillusionment. The promise of modernity seemed hollow. New political ideologies like communism, fascism, and socialism rose in response to social inequalities and unrest. The world was polarized, unsure of its direction. This context of chaos and uncertainty likely colored Dienach's subconscious and the visions he experienced while in his coma. The idea of a broken world, collapsing governments, and future chaos echoed the fears and experiences of his time. At the same time, the early 20th century was a hotbed of spiritual exploration and alternative philosophies. The widespread trauma of war and social change led many to question traditional religion and seek new meanings. Movements like theosophy, spiritualism, and occultism gained traction. People were fascinated by mysticism, psychic phenomena, and the possibility of life beyond death. Figures like Helena Blavatsky and Rudolf Steiner were influential in popularizing ideas about higher consciousness, reincarnation, and spiritual evolution. The idea that humanity was on a path of conscious growth was a common theme. Dienach's experience, his consciousness traveling to the future and inhabiting another person, fits into this broader spiritual conversation about the nature of the soul, time, and reincarnation. In addition, early psychology was just beginning to explore altered states of mind. Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung were uncovering the deep workings of the unconscious, dreams, and archetypes. Jung, in particular, developed ideas about the collective unconscious and how symbols and myths shape human experience across time and cultures. Dienach's visions might be seen as tapping into this collective unconscious, blending personal trauma with universal symbols of human evolution. The dawn of the 20th century was also a time when people were both fascinated and anxious about the future. The rapid pace of technological innovation, from cars and airplanes to radio and electricity, transformed daily life. At the same time, the horrors of war and industrialization raised questions about what kind of future awaited humanity. Science fiction was beginning to emerge as a genre, exploring utopias and dystopias, time travel, and advanced civilizations. Writers like H.G. Wells were popularizing ideas about traveling through time and the consequences of technological progress. Dienach's writings can be seen as part of this cultural moment, a deeply imaginative exploration of what could lie ahead. His vision of a world without money, war, or borders echoes contemporary hopes for peace and unity, but also taps into anxieties about the dangers of unchecked technology and social collapse. It's also worth considering how Dienach's own physical condition might have influenced his experience. Comas can induce vivid hallucinations or altered states of consciousness. The brain in such a state can generate rich symbolic imagery that blends memory, fear, hope, and subconscious processing. Given the timing, Dienach's coma happened just after World War I. During a period of intense social and personal upheaval, it's possible that his mind was processing not only his physical trauma, but the trauma of the world around him. His visions of a broken, collapsing future could be understood as symbolic representations of his internal and external realities. Understanding the cultural and historical context helps us appreciate how Dienach's story reflects the hopes, fears, and philosophical currents of his time. Whether or not his experience was literal, it captured something very real about the collective psyche of early 20th century Europe, a world caught between old empires and new possibilities, between destruction and the dream of renewal. For those steeped in spiritual or esoteric traditions, his story felt like a validation of their beliefs about consciousness and evolution. For skeptics, it was more likely a product of his cultural environment, shaped by the anxieties and hopes swirling around him. Other time travel and future vision accounts. Dienach's extraordinary tale of waking up in the year 3906 and witnessing a radically transformed human civilization is one that naturally invites comparison. Throughout history and across cultures, countless individuals have claimed glimpses of the future, time travel, or prophetic visions, from ancient oracles to modern psychics. Examining Dienach's story alongside these accounts helps us understand its place in a long tradition of human fascination with time and destiny, and also what sets it apart. One of the most famous early figures associated with future visions is Nostradamus, the 16th century French seer, whose cryptic quatrains have been interpreted as predicting events from wars to natural disasters. Nostradamus's writings are intentionally vague and symbolic, allowing broad interpretations, which has helped his prophecies endure for centuries. While Dienach's account is more narrative and detailed, both share the theme of warning humanity about future crises and the potential for change. Another striking comparison is Edgar Cayce, the so-called sleeping prophet of the early 20th century, who entered trance-like states to deliver visions of future events and spiritual teachings. Like Dienach, Cayce's predictions included global upheavals, shifts in consciousness, and the eventual rise of a new, more enlightened era. Both figures gained devoted followers who believed their visions contained truths about humanity's destiny, even if skeptics questioned their validity. In the realm of science fiction and speculative thought, writers such as H.G. Wells and Jules Verne popularized imaginative journeys through time, often as a way to explore social and moral questions. Dienach's story blurs the line between fiction and alleged experience, sharing the narrative depth and social critique common in science fiction, but presented as a first-hand account. What makes Dienach's story unique? While many future visions are abstract or symbolic, Dienach's narrative stands out for its immersive and detailed description of a distant future society. Unlike Nostradamus's cryptic verses or Cayce's trance pronouncements, Dienach's account reads like a travelogue, full of observations about daily life, governance, technology, and human consciousness. This level of detail creates a vivid, almost tangible future world, which invites readers to imagine not just the outcome, but the journey humanity must undertake to get there. Another unique aspect is Dienach's claim that his consciousness literally traveled forward in time and inhabited another person's body. Most time travel or prophetic accounts come from dreams, visions, or trance states, but Dienach described a kind of experiential time displacement that few other stories parallel. This raises fascinating questions about the nature of consciousness and time. Was this a mental projection, a spiritual journey, or something else entirely? Stories of future visions and time travel often tell us as much about the present as the future. They reveal collective anxieties, hopes, and questions about where humanity is headed. Dienach's story, like those of many seers and writers before him, reflects early 20th century concerns, the devastation of war, the threat of social collapse, and the desire for a more harmonious world. Similarly, contemporary accounts of time travel or future visions often revolve around technological change, environmental crisis, and evolving consciousness. These narratives act as mirrors. They project our current fears and aspirations onto imagined futures, offering warnings or inspiration. Why do stories like Dienach's endure? One reason is that they tap into a deep human desire for meaning and control in an uncertain world. The idea that someone can glimpse the future and bring back warnings or hope is profoundly comforting and compelling. Whether these stories are true, in a literal sense, may be less important than their impact on readers and cultures. Dienach's journals have inspired debate, skepticism, and fascination precisely because they feel personal and immersive. They invite readers to question reality, time, and consciousness in ways that abstract predictions cannot. The debate over Dienach's claims. As fascinating as Dienach's story is, it hasn't escaped controversy. Since his journals were published, many have questioned their authenticity, the meaning of his claims, and whether he truly experienced what he described. After all, it's rare for someone to claim living inside another person's body nearly 2,000 years in the future. Skeptics argue that Dienach's visions could have been vivid dreams, hallucinations caused by his coma, or simply creative fiction. The early 20th century was rich with interest in spiritualism, occultism, and psychic phenomena, leading some critics to believe his writings reflect the hopes and ideas of that era rather than genuine future knowledge. Without solid proof, many dismiss the story as intriguing but unprovable. Others highlight inconsistencies and vague details, suggesting the timeline and descriptions might be symbolic or metaphorical rather than literal predictions. Some even speculate that George Papachotsis, who translated and published the journals, may have added his own interpretations or embellishments. Despite these doubts, Dienach's account has gained a dedicated following. Readers interested in spirituality, consciousness, and alternative views of time find his writings compelling, especially because they focus on human awareness evolving rather than just technology or politics. For many, it feels less like wild prophecy and more like a vision of what's possible if humanity transforms fundamentally. Dienach's story challenges us to reconsider how we understand time, consciousness, and the future. It pushes the boundaries of science and philosophy, inviting questions about whether reality is fixed or fluid and interconnected. While we may never know for sure what happened during Dienach's coma, his writings continue to inspire debate, curiosity, and hope. Whether you see him as a time traveler, mystic, or creative thinker, the questions he raises about humanity's future remain deeply relevant today. Do you believe his experience? Share what you think in the comment section below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't.